Hi guys, welcome back to another video, or your first video here. Welcome if you're new here, welcome either way. This is going to be my slightly late June 2022 reading wrap up, and I have quite a few books to talk about, so let's just get into it. So I would say that I had a really good reading month, but I did have things sort of across the board, so I'm just going to start with a couple of DNFs. I think at one point during the month I was just in the mood for something lighter and maybe not fluffier, but I think that because I thought I was in that mood, I borrowed a bunch of audiobooks from a couple of apps and tried a bunch out, and a lot of them didn't work for me, so a lot of them are going to appear in the DNF section. So first one is Meet Cute Club. Now, the bar at setting this as part of my TBR was literally just that I knew it was gay, and I wanted to try it out before I bought it because I knew that romance is not normally my thing. This is about someone who works at a bookshop and someone who's really into romance novels, and they sort of clash on their opinion of what makes a good book, and over the course of the novel they sort of slowly fall in love. It's not that I wasn't having a good time, I just realised like very quickly that it wasn't going to be my thing, so I'm glad that I gave it a go. And if this sort of like more fluffier gay adult romance sounds good to you, then I think it was well written but just not my thing. Oh, look at that, another romance. So I have Count Your Lucky Stars, and this one I was quite into the writing actually. I thought that it was written fairly well, but this one there were too many things where I was like, that isn't really how that would go down in real life. There was a couple of things to do with her job. So anyway, this is to do with a wedding planner who gets their sort of big break. They get given a really important client, and as they go to plan this client's wedding, someone in the wedding party is an old lover of theirs. First of all, there was the miscommunication trope, which I really hate. I hate it when the characters literally could have had one conversation and you wouldn't have a book anymore. And also just to do with the wedding planning business. I know that with a lot of books you have to suspend your disbelief, but with this it was just too prevalent with how many things were going on, where I was like, that's so unprofessional, and if you were paying someone this amount of money and this happened, like it wouldn't pan out like this. So yeah, I decided to give up on this one as well, that those things were just bothering me too much. Next one is a book called Tink and Wendy. So this is a Peter Pan retelling. There seem to be quite a lot of those at the moment going around, and this one promised to be sort of a poly relationship between Tinkerbell, Wendy and Peter. And for me, I think that the concept was really interesting, but I don't think there was enough effort put into describing the magic system. Like, I was getting very confused, and also the timeline. So not only the so this is where I've got my what I'm reading written down, but not only with the chronology of events, but also with the time that it was set. I just don't think there was enough time and effort put into placing the story. And a book with this premise, if it came up again, I would be interested in checking it out. Just this one wasn't for me. So the next one I actually do have a physical copy of, and that is Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith. Now, I have been recently really trying to get into poetry. I think that it's a genre of literature that I know very little about, and this one I've heard very good things about, and the fact that it fits my bar of it was gay. So I did try this out, but unfortunately this falls into the category of poetry for me where I didn't really get what was going on. I think that's completely on me and not the book. I've heard so many good things about this, and there were a couple of poems in here that really like struck home and I thought were really powerful. I think I actually posted one on my Instagram, but let me see if I can find it now. Dear Badge Number. I thought that one was a really powerful poem. But yeah, I just think that there were so many choices going on in terms of where to stop a sentence and where to continue onto a paragraph, and so many formatting choices that I was like, I'm sure this means something in terms of the actual book, but I don't know what it means and I'm not understanding what the poem is about. So I decided to give up on this one. But this one for me is not a, oh, it was bad. It was, I still recommend it, just maybe to people who are smarter at understanding poetry, which is not me. And my next DNF, I literally cannot remember what it is, so I'm going to have to look up on Goodreads. That shows you how memorable that was. So the next one I have here is First Time for Everything, and this was a book club book that I just could not continue with. I had so many problems with this. No one in the book club really seemed to like it, and I felt really bad because I think that the library that we were doing it had an author event with the author coming up, and like he wanted us to come up with some like interview questions for him, so that was a bit of a struggle. But yeah, this did not work for me. I just, oh, the main character was just so awful. Like, again, this was another romance novel, so I thought, okay, maybe with this sort of lighter tone, I could get into it. So the first problem I had was with the synopsis. Now, I know that a lot of authors do not have any control as to what goes in the synopsis of their book, how the book is marketed, what their cover is like, what their title is. So I realised that this is not the fault of the author, or probably not, but the synopsis led me to go into this with really different expectations from what I ended up getting. So from the synopsis, it says about this main character who essentially thinks they have the perfect life, they have a brilliant partner, they have a great living situation, etc., etc. And then them getting a STD diagnosis sort of shakes up their entire world. They sort of find out that their boyfriend's been cheating on them, and spirals a bunch of things happening in their life all at once. They get kicked out of their living situation, and from the synopsis and from the sort of way it was written, I had assumed that diagnosis would be for HIV, and it was going to be a sort of more hard-hitting story with an underthread of romance. But when I was reading it, and this is like in the first chapter, it was literally just an SDI that the person was like, yeah, it's painful and embarrassing, but here's some antibiotics and you'll be fine, and that's it. And I was like, which is great for the character, but it's just not what I was expecting. My next problem is the writing style. So because of the fact that it's first person, I always struggle with first person narratives in terms of description. Like, often authors want a lush description and want to be inside somebody's head, and I just really kept on thinking, this isn't how someone talks to themselves in their own head. Like, the sort of descriptions that they were giving of the people and the places around them, I was like, I mean, maybe people do think like this, but it was just really taking me out of the story. Also, just the fact that the main character was just such an asshole. Like, I really need to adjust my expectation of romance novels. If you guys are more well-versed in the genre, then please do let me know if this is a thing. But I had always assumed that a romance novel had a very sort of bland or likable main character, so that they could sort of be a reader insert character and the reader could experience the romance of the book. Maybe that's just a wrong assumption I have, but in both of these sort of very heavy romance novels that I've read for the book club, they've had really irritating main characters, and with this one it was just so much worse than the one I was talking about previously, The Split. And I just couldn't stand being in his own head. The way that he would talk about his friends, the way that he judged people, the way that he was making excuses for the fact that his partner didn't wash, and I was like, that is so gross. And I was just like, I really want to know whether or not the author intended for this character to be so flawed. I really am curious as to how they were supposed to be perceived, because my hope is that throughout the novel he'd sort of learn lessons and realise that he was being a complete arsehole. But yeah, it was just not the genre that I normally pick up. So if I continue with a book that's in the romance genre, I have to really be into it. A main character that I hated, and from the discussions that people were having in the book group, I don't think that the problems I was having ever really got solved. So yeah, this was another DNF for me. Right, now on to my 3 stars. So the first one is a comic, and I found that Tokyo Pop, which is a comic and manga publisher, have been starting to really focus on more diverse stories. So I've noticed a bunch of LGBT stories get published. This might be also why quite a few of them I've noticed haven't been of the same quality as a lot of that other stuff. I think they're probably just trying to reach a quota, which is unfortunate. So I read Puppy Love, which I don't really have much to say about it. It was cute, it was fun, but I found the plot incredibly basic. The art style wasn't really my favourite, and it's the sort of thing where there were a couple of plot points where I thought they were going somewhere and they just went nowhere. And this is about a guy who decides that he wants to adopt a dog, and a person working at a sort of puppy shop. Not much else to say about that. So the next one is Be Gay, Do Crimes by Imogen Maxwell Tweed. I have read a number of their short stories, and this has been the first one that's kind of been a flop for me. I noticed a lot of DNFs and a lot of 2 stars on the Goodreads, so it seems to not work for many people. So this is a story about 2 women who, it's very clear that they've both had big crushes on each other, but they are going to a school reunion, and one of them, their ex-husband, abusive ex-husband, shows up at their door and then winds up dead. And they sort of flee the scene, and because they didn't kill him, and they decide to go to the reunion, and they sort of leave a crime spree in their wake. Now, I think this was a combination of things why this didn't quite work for me. I was interested enough to keep reading, although there were not, even though it was probably a 3-hour audiobook, there were times I considered DNFing, which is, I think, very telling. First of all, the sort of crimes that they were getting up to, I had different expectations for. I thought they were going to be far bigger crimes. Not that they were doing them on purpose, but far greater sort of accidental crimes. And so once it did actually get going into bigger crimes, it seemed to come out of nowhere. And then also, especially in that area, I thought there was quite a big plot hole as to why that was even a thing. Again, I'm being vague because if for some reason you want to try this out, I don't want to give anything away. Also, the fact that the book is dual perspective and you change between the 2 characters, and I could not tell them apart to save my life. I had to really concentrate on what character we were following in that particular chapter, and I just think that, yeah, I think it was fine, hence the 3-star, but I'm not going to think about this again, and I'm not going to, buy a copy for my collection, so there. Next we have Secret at Skull House. So this is the sequel to Murder at Pirates Cove, which is a male cozy mystery novel series, and it's so warm here. I really enjoyed the first book. I thought the romance was cute. I thought that the hijinks were fun. It was a sort of read in one sitting kind of story. And when I saw that Scribd had the sequel, I was like, okay, download and I'll try that. And this is my issue with cozy mystery novel series, is that you have a circumstance happen in the first novel often where either your character will happen upon a mystery and decide that they're going to be the one to solve it, or they will be implicated in a crime and have to solve it before they go to prison wrongly for something they didn't do. This was the latter, and I just find with both of those situations, it's really difficult to get a long-running series working really well with that premise, because every time it's like, I mean, how likely is it going to be that within a couple of months someone is going to be implicated for murder twice in this quaint little small town that has never known any crime? It's just, I mean, I'm sure that in the next book it wouldn't be that same situation. It would be something else, like they happen upon something. But it's the same reason why I really struggle to get into murder mystery series. I used to really enjoy Midsummer Murders when I was younger, but then I was like, seriously, how many people can die in this one small, quaint, rural place before, like, people are like, oh, this is suspicious that so many people have died. We don't have any villagers left. So yeah, this just didn't work for me in that sense. It was just a fine read. It was fun, it was light for an evening, but I'm never going to think about it again. And yeah, that's it. The next one, again, was clearly so memorable that I can't remember it, so I'm going to have to look up what it was. Okay, so it was another poetry collection by Amanda Lovelace. I've read a lot of her poetry over the past couple of months, and this one just didn't really work for me in the same way that her others have. I mean, it may be a case of I'm just reading too much at once, but I don't think so. I just found this one to be too repetitive, especially in both the language that was used and the messages that it was trying to give across. I think that most of her poetry collections do have a sort of theme running through it, but I think that there is such a variety of themes covered that the overall theme doesn't feel like it's being hammered home to quite the extent that this one did. Whereas I think with this, I kind of felt like by the halfway point, I was like, okay, I get it. I'd like some sort of new conversations to be happening. I did like still enjoy it, and I still got a lot out of it. It just wasn't my favourite of hers. Okay, and the next one is the same. The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one. This is another of her poetry collections, and I think the exact same thing. I think that it wasn't her strongest. I didn't enjoy it as much as her other stuff, and I think that it was a bit too repetitive in terms of its theming for me to really get on board. The next book I have here, I actually have a physical copy of, and that is Frostblood by Ellie Blake. In terms of enjoyment, this was such a fun read, and I was really gripped the whole way through, but I don't think it's going to stay super memorable in my head over time, because I think I've just read this story before. I think that this was very much a rehashing of books that already exist. I think that you could, if you sort of combined The Hunger Games and Red Queen, I think if you combined those two, you'd get this. This is about a society where there are people who have different magic or no magic at all, and you have people who can wield frost and people who can wield fire. And it's essentially a racial commentary. These two groups are trying to wipe each other out, they don't trust each other, and this Fireblood gets captured and then released by some Frostbloods who essentially want to use her to take down the corrupt government, and they want to use her as a weapon, and they both do not trust each other, and it's a case of testing loyalties, and there's training, and there's coming to trust people who are from a different background than you. And I think that the conversations in here were all brilliant. I think if you're looking for a young adult dystopian fantasy that has sort of young people taking down the corrupt system, I think this is a fine time. I did enjoy this, but it's not going to be one that I think will stay super memorable in my head. And the next 3.5 star I have here is Trans People Are Here, or Were Here? There Are Trans People Here, which I thought was a really interesting collection of poetry, and I'm really glad that this collection does exist. I just think that the reason why I didn't give it the full 4 stars is that, again, there was sort of some poetry that I didn't quite understand, and I completely recognise that that's on me. And I think that trans people especially will really appreciate the, how did one reviewer quote it? The expressions of trans joy in here were really lovely to see, and I think something we don't get enough in literature in general. So I'm glad this exists, not quite the perfect fit for me. And that's it for my 3.5 stars, so let's get on to my 4 stars. I figured I might as well get all my other poetry out the way because I have very similar things to say about it. So essentially I read a bunch more of Amanda Lovelace's poetry in June, and a lot of it I really enjoyed and really worked for me. So we have Shine Your Icy Crown, Flower Crowns and Fearsome Things, Unlock Your Storybook Heart, and To Drink Coffee with a Ghost. And all of these, I would say, I really enjoyed the writing style. It wasn't over my head in any way. and I really enjoyed the hard-hitting messages, not enjoy them, but I enjoyed the discussion of the hard-hitting messages that this author has with those. So the next book I have here is The Mercies. This book took me a little while to read. It was a book club book from a little while ago. It's a historical retelling of a coastal town off the coast of Norway, I think, where there was a huge storm and almost all of the men were killed off in this storm, and it was this sort of town of women who had to survive. And the fact that it was both historical fiction and sort of following a lot of characters in one coastal town is why it took me so long to get into it. I find that with historical fiction, you often already know how a lot of the story is going to pan out, and it's often more character-based rather than plot-driven. So I really enjoyed the reading experience while I was reading it, but as soon as I wasn't reading it, there was no like, oh, I wonder what happens, to draw me back to reading it. So I read it in sort of a couple of chunks. Also with stories that follow a small town where you're following every character and all the characters are sort of important to the narrative. It takes me a while to get everyone straight so that I understand what's actually happening. But once those two things happened, like once I got into the more historical nature of it and once I got all the characters straight, I really, really enjoyed this. I think this author has such a way of characterization. One, I found the relationship between these two women really, really tender and sweet, but also the way that this character writes men, like every time they spoke, I was like, ugh, like they were so viscerally hateable. And I think that the situations that they were in, because men sort of come to this town under the name of doing God's work, because they think, women, surviving on their own without husbands, like witchcraft, basically. And it was the entitlement that these men had to the women of the town and their bodies and their resources and it was so gross, but also so real as well, given how situations like this, I'm sure, happened throughout history and also continue to happen just in slightly different ways. And it was just so revolting. And I think that visceral reaction that I had is a real testament to this author's writing, and I highly recommend this. Also, a female-female romance in this, just to point that out. Man, I don't have a lot of copies of the books I'm talking about this month. So the next one I have is Trixie and Katya's Guide to Modern Womanhood. So this is following two drag queens who have sort of made more of a name for themselves over time by having a YouTube series together where they chat to each other about issues and things and fun things, and it's a lot of fun, and I decided to pick this up. I found this a really raw and open discussion. I think that some drag queen books haven't worked for me because of how closed off I think the main character can feel. And again, that's completely someone's prerogative. If they want to write a non-fiction where they don't want to be that open about things, then that's completely their choice. But my personal preference in terms of non-fiction about a person or ideas that a person has is that I would much rather someone be vulnerable and honest. And this is how that was. It was still funny and witty and very reminiscent of these two drag personas, but it was also honest about drug use in the gay community and about, what it does mean to be a woman in the modern age and the labels that we place upon ourselves, the boxes that we sort of squish ourselves into to try and fit into society standards. I just think that it was such an interesting book, but also a lot of fun, hence why the 4 stars. The next book I have to talk about is a short story from the author of Circe and The Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller, and this was just fantastic. I think that I don't wish it was a full-length novel. I have heard that a lot from people who have read it, but actually I think it works fantastically as a short story. This is a retelling of the Pygmalion story where a sculptor essentially falls in love with his sculptures and prays to the gods to have the sculpture made real, and that is granted to him. And this is all from the perspective of the sculptor Galatea. And it was such a fascinating look at sort of men and like the feeling that they have ownership over a woman's body and a woman's mind, and how someone can love something that doesn't speak and doesn't have any opinions as a statue, but as soon as that statue becomes a woman, there's then hatred, and it was just such a really interesting look. So Pygmalion's name is also never mentioned in the entire book. It very much gave me Dracula's Brides or The Colour Purple or Handmaid's Tale vibes in that way. It was very much about little ways in which you can take back power, and I think Galatea really takes back that power by never mentioning her husband's name. Also just the being in the head of a woman who knows or has had to learn what to do to placate a man and not cause violence to happen to her or others, I think really reminded me of a book called Damsel, and also The Silence of the Girls. And I think that it just works so well as a short story to get across this message of, hey, this is horrifying. The original Greek myth is presented as this beautiful, happy story for Pygmalion. And when you really think about it, it's a very horrifying story about men owning women. And I think that having that message of actually don't just believe something is a happy story just because the author wants you to believe that, and actually to critically look at the situation of the characters, I think was a really interesting take, and I would highly recommend this one. Bit of a change in pace from the last one, but the next 4-star I have is Alex's Adventures in Numberland. This is a non-fiction book about maths, and I know that that sounds really weird in the context of what else I've been reading, but when I was younger, I think in GCSEs or A-levels, I went to a series of lectures all about maths with my school, and I remember a number of people falling asleep, but I really loved it because I'm a nerd. But one of the people was the author of this book, and even how many years later that was from now, I vividly remember a lot of the points that he was making in this lecture. And something that he mentioned was the fact that he had written this book. And so when I saw it on Audible, I was like, hey, that's that book that was from ages ago. And I decided to pick it up. And I loved it. He has such a way of describing really complex mathematical systems in such an easily digestible way, and also just a fun way. He goes through a lot of not only scientific studies, but just his experiences of talking to people, and he goes through the evolutionary understanding of maths to why do we have 60 minutes in an hour, and you know, like things I've never thought about before, like the guy who invented the Sudoku, or like gambling. There were so many things that he talked about that were just so fascinating, and I highly recommend this. It was a lot of fun. Okay, with this next book, I think that something I said earlier isn't going to make much sense. I read Murder of Pirates Cove in the same month that I also read the sequel, which I completely forgot about. So hopefully that makes sense in the way that I'm going to have to edit this. But essentially, this book follows someone new to a small coastal town. He, from his great aunt or great grandmother or some distant relation, can you tell I read this a little while ago? Some distant relation has left him a failing bookshop and a crumbling manor. And I'm assuming that over the course of the entire series, he's going to do up the house and make sure that the bookshop doesn't fall under. And the owner of a rival bookshop turns up dead in his shop with the antique sword that hangs in his shop, and so he is implicated for the murder of this person. So he has to solve the murder and figure out who killed this guy before he himself is blamed for it, and also he's having a bit of a romance with the police chief person. And I had a lot of fun with this. Like I said earlier on in the video that I've read the sequel and I didn't enjoy it as much. This was a fine time, lovely male romance, very easy read. It was at no point gratuitous or violent or gross to read. It was I think it's a very safe read if people want to sort of have a segue into the mystery thriller genre, and it was highly enjoyable, so 4 stars. So I have two more books to talk about, and those are both 5 stars. The first being this play called Immaculate by Oliver Lansley. I always stop myself when I look at the word Oliver to make sure that it's not Olivier, because the amount of times people call it the Oliver Awards, and it's very, very funny, but I need to make sure I don't do it myself. So this was a reread for me. The friend who lent it to me and another friend of ours, I suggested that we get together and read this, and we had a lovely time at the London Super Bloom at the Tower of London, and then just sat down and read this together. And I don't know why this was categorized as a 4-star on my Goodreads, because this is definitely a 5-star read. I love this book so much. So this is a play about a woman who gets pregnant, and she starts off the book very heavily pregnant, and she can't understand how that has happened because she hasn't had sex in over 9 months. And a bunch of people show up at her house and claim that either they are the father of the kid or know who the father of the kid is, 2 of those people being God and the devil. And it's just a hilarious story, and so tongue-in-cheek. I was so nervous about going into this one, looking at the synopsis and seeing the very heavily religious overtones, not even undertones, of it, but actually reading it this time, I think that the religious discussions in here were very respectfully done, but also brought up a lot of points and discussions with that the characters were having about how a lot of these older stories work in modern times. Like, the character is talking to God's messenger, and she's like, so, he didn't ask me, I didn't get consent in this, God's not going to pay childcare, this, and like all these really interesting topics that you don't really think about when you think about the old Bible stories. And it's a hilarious read. I would highly recommend. And yeah, this was great. And I've been filming for nearly 45 minutes. God, I hope this video is not as long as it took me to film. The last book that I have to talk to you about, also a 5 stars, is This Is How You Lose the Time War. And this book, I know is not going to work for everyone. It's very weird, unexplained sci-fi, also very gay, about a war happening throughout time, and these 2 agents on rival sides and their correspondence that they start up with each other and the relationships that they form. And it was just such a beautiful story between the 2 of them. I know that some people are going to read this and need far more explanation than they get. It's very, very weird. It's very much not grounded in any sort of reality or even scenes, but I just thought it was so beautifully written. I really loved the playfulness between the characters. I thought that they learned a lot from each other, and also just the concept of a time war. I didn't quite understand that going in, but it's kind of like you send an agent to somewhere to change a tiny thing in a timeline because of the fact that it will affect a timeline later on, or the butterfly effect will change things. It could be as small as introducing someone to an idea earlier than they were supposed to have it, or it could have been as big as wiping out an entire city of people that were going to do something or wouldn't have done something, or so that area could have been cleared for something else, and then enemy agents seeing how that affected the timeline and then sending their own agents to change tiny things around time so that they win at the end. And it was such an interesting concept between the 2 of them, and it was clear that you had these 2 women who were at the top of their game, and also you got to see these 2 characters be ruthless, and you didn't spend pages and pages and pages of them going, oh my god, how could I have done this, which I think you do find with some books about morally grey characters. You don't have that here, which wouldn't fit either. Like, these characters have almost been created to fight this war, to have them spend a bunch of time dwelling on the terrible things they've done, I think would have been really out of character for them. So I'm glad that didn't have that, and it just worked for me. I know that it's not going to work for a lot of people. If you need any sort of grounding in understanding, Actually, I think that I would put... This book has a completely different plot, but I think that if This Is How You Lose the Time War works for you, I think The Star at Sea will work for you, and vice versa. This is, again, the sort of book where it really works for me just because I didn't really need it to be grounded in anything. Like, all these things do link together if you can sort of wade through the weirdness and just enjoy the ride, which I do. So I think that these two books I would almost recommend in tandem. Very different, but maybe I need to film another, if you like that, try this video. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. But yes, this is the end of that very, very long video. Hopefully I can edit it to be slightly less time than 3/4 of an hour, but oh dear. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please let me know about a recent read that you have had, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.